Hello, everyone. My name is Clarisol Duque, and I serve as IWIL Training Academy's one of the board of directors. And it's my privilege to welcome you to our annual Dawn Clark Netsch Policy Forum. Our timely topic is guarding democracy, promoting integrity and trust in the 2024 election. Each year, we sponsor this forum in memory of Dawn Clark Netsch, a trailblazer in Illinois politics. She was a state senator, Illinois comptroller, and Democratic candidate for governor. She was one of the first women to teach in a United States law school. She worked for women's rights, civil rights, and in other words, human rights. She was one of IWIL's founding mothers, and so we're so grateful you can join us today to honor her memory. I'd now like to introduce Gail Schnitzer Eisenberg to share more about Dawn. Gail is a recent graduate of IWIL Training Academy's class of 2024, and she had the privilege of studying local government under Dawn Clark Netsch at Northwestern Law. Welcome, Gail.
Thank you. Dawn Clark Netsch wanted to go into politics since she was a young girl. It was that interest in politics that brought her to law school, which she was pleasantly surprised that she enjoyed. Despite being the only woman in her class, Dawn graduated first at Northwestern Law School in 1952. She then worked as an associate at a white shoe firm in DC, where Dawn noted that the men would go out to these lunches at clubs that didn't even permit women and make decisions based on her work product. Dawn returned to Illinois to assist Governor Kerner, helping to create the Board of Education, among other initiatives. But she found that the General Assembly, quote, didn't want her working the floor. It was a private club. Illinois was far behind in electing women. So she returned to Chicago to become the first female professor at Northwestern Law School. Dawn served as a delegate to the Illinois Constitutional Convention, where she championed the inclusion of gender equality in our Constitution, which we still don't have in our federal one, and not for lack of trying on Dawn's part. Apropos to today's discussion, Dawn is credited with obtaining Mayor Daley's support for the 1970 ratification, which had been withheld in opposition in part to the creation of the State Board of Elections, by emphasizing the benefits of home rule authority to Chicago. Without Chicago's vote, the Constitution would not have passed. Dawn represented the north side of Chicago in the state Senate for 18 years, starting in 1972 as an independent Democrat. As a legislator, she was a constant sponsor of civil rights and healthcare legislation, particularly for women and the LGBTQ community. In a 1977 interview, Dawn admitted that she was unable to pass many bills as a political outsider, but considered creating state-financed alcoholism treatment centers one of her most satisfying legislative achievements. She wished she could have obtained merit selection of judges, but we continue to elect judges here in the state. Dawn was firmly committed to the idea of making it easier for people to vote and against artificial barriers which limit voter participation, as she stated. While in the Senate, Dawn was one of 15 legislators on whom the Chicago Police Department spied. She feared the chilling effect that such surveillance could have on political participation and warned against the impact of public officials being totally dependent on their elected positions. In 1990, Dawn became the first woman elected to statewide constitutional office in Illinois when she was elected controller. In 1994's primary, Dawn became the first Democratic woman chosen to run for governor, and although she came up short, she returned to teaching at Northwestern Law School. She continued to serve on various task forces and, most importantly for our purposes today, helped to found IWIL in 2002. It was at that law school that I was lucky enough to study state and local government with Dawn, as she literally wrote the book on the subject. While I was reviewing my 66-page course outline in preparation for today's program, I noted her observation that no area of law in recent history has brought the courts into more direct supervisory role over the states and local governments than voting rights. At Dawn's memorial in 2013, Senator Durbin said, "She was always the smartest person in the room and a person of absolute, unshakable integrity. I think she would be incredibly proud of the public officials that she has inspired and IWIL has trained to serve with that same integrity. And I look forward to learning more about our democracy at today's forum in her name.
Thank you so much, Gail. We really appreciate you being here with us to share a little more about Dawn's legacy, which is really, truly an inspiration to all of us. Before I introduce our esteemed panelists, I would like to share that we will reserve some time at the end of the forum for discussion questions. So please feel free to put your questions in the chat function, and our staff will be collecting these throughout our time together. So it's a great privilege to have Illinois Secretary of State Alexi Giannoulias here with us tonight. Secretary Giannoulias has been a leading force for election security and voter accessibility. He's a strong advocate for legislation aimed at making it easier for all Illinoisans to register and vote. Secretary Giannoulias, I find it hard to believe that I've known you for as long as I have, but it was 2006 when you ran and were elected as the first Democrat in 12 years to hold that office of Illinois Treasurer. So it's good to be with you. Thank you so very much for joining IWIL for this important forum.
Thank you for having me.
We also have Lauren Miller Karalunas from the Brennan Center for Justice. Lauren is counsel in the Brennan Center's Democracy Program, where she focuses on voting rights, election interference, and the program's constitutional litigation and jurisprudential initiatives. While Lauren lives and works in New York now, she is a native Illinoisan. Lauren and I met in 2012 when she and I worked together at Senator Durbin's Chicago office. Lauren, it's great to have you with us tonight as well. All right, so we have a big topic to dive into, so let's get started. Last weekend, the Chicago Humanities Festival hosted Malcolm Gladwell at the Ramova Theater here in Bridgeport. I was happy to attend since it's right here in my neighborhood. Gladwell took questions at the end of the program, and he was asked if he thought we were at a tipping point for democracy. He paused for a moment and thought about it a little longer than I had hoped for, but ultimately, he said he didn't think we are at a tipping point. He pointed to the fact that we spend a lot of time espousing our individual views, but not listening to each other. He said we still have a lot more in common than what sets us apart. So I'm going to start by asking each one of you, do you think that we're at a tipping point in democracy? Alexi, we'll start with you.
Again, thank you for having me. I want to thank IWIL for the incredible work that you do, for being an inspiration to so many people, for getting people engaged in the civic process. Clarisol, it's great to see you, to members of the board and people who hopped on. My goal is to not be boring at all, but I'm thrilled to be here. And obviously, Dawn Clark Netsch was a hero, an icon. We're lucky in Illinois to have so many great leaders, and she's on the Mount Rushmore, and I'm honored to be here. To answer your question, let me start with a little background. I'm not an alarmist, and I'm overly optimistic and sometimes overly naive. I agree with what Malcolm Gladwell said. I do think there's a lot more that we agree on, that binds us together, that we share in a common way. But I also think right now, American democracy is especially vulnerable to the flames of disinformation and distrust. And I will tell you, not to be partisan, but the truth of the matter is Donald Trump is the chief arsonist when it comes to us being so vulnerable to these flames. And it's dangerous, and the rhetoric and the vitriol is really gotten out of hand. And to me, this is not about Democrat or Republican. This is, one party is talking about policy and public policy and what we want to do and how we impact people's lives and how we fight for the middle class, how we fight for women's rights, how we look to the future on important issues like climate change, how we deal with the next generation of clean energy jobs, how do we deal with AI and all these geopolitical challenges that we're facing. And you have Donald Trump, who literally is just a flamethrower. And to answer your question directly, there are some mornings where I wake up and I think that we're on the precipice, and other times I feel safe with the foundations in place. Ironically enough, this sounds crazy, but I actually think there's more danger to our democracy if it's a close race and Donald Trump loses, because I think they'll do anything. And the biggest damage Donald Trump has ever done to this country is to make people believe in a completely different reality that's not based on science, facts, and he's able to just move people's thoughts and feelings on all these key issues and literally make something that's factual and turn it into something that's not even real. That's very scary to someone like me who believes in the importance of our democracy. So I do think I do honestly believe that we are at a tipping point, because I don't think people are paying attention, especially Trump voters, to the damage, the generational damage he's doing to our democracy, and the fundamentals of what our Constitution has guided us towards.
Lauren, do you think we're at a tipping point on democracy?
Thank you so much, Clarisol, and thank you also just for having me. As you mentioned at the beginning, I'm counsel at the Brennan Center for Justice at the NYU School of Law, which is a nonpartisan organization dedicated to securing free, safe, and fair elections for all. And so to answer your question, I think it's important to remember on the one hand that our democratic systems have been tested before. And over centuries, time and time again, when they have been tested, they have worked and they have withstood those challenges. But at the same time, as you noted, we are really seeing an unprecedented, remarkably well-coordinated and well-funded attack on the integrity of our elections, an attack that is premised in the false claim that the 2020 presidential election was stolen and that widespread fraud continues to pervade our election system. And those are claims that are not only just plainly false and rooted in conspiracy theories, but also, for that matter, they are often rooted in plainly kind of insidious, race-based, gender-based, and nationality-based attacks. And so what this election is really a referendum on that movement when it comes to making sure we participate in our democracy. It is a time to say that, no, these false claims aren't going to deter us from voting. And for all of us to make sure our family and friends and our neighbors make this voice heard and cast their ballot in this election, whether that's through early voting or vote by mail or going to the polls in person.
Thank you, Lauren. Alexi, I actually want to double down on the ideals of democracy with you. When I opened the Sunday New York Times, I was happy to see a full-page ad taken out by Greeks for Democracy. Your name was listed alongside other prominent Greek Americans. The ad endorses the Kamala Walz ticket, but it really goes deeper into the ideals of democracy. As a daughter of immigrants myself, I was moved by the virtues that ad extolled. Can you share more about this campaign and why it's important to you to make this kind of statement?
Yes, great question. So the Greeks for Democracy was started by progressive Greeks, common sense Greek Americans. And as you mentioned, both my parents were immigrants. They came to this country from Greece separately. They met here. They didn't speak the language. They didn't know anyone, but they worked very hard and they sacrificed and they struggled so that their three boys could have every opportunity. And this country, the greatest country in the world, gave them the opportunity to do so. And they built a nice life. And now their son is the Secretary of State of the greatest state and the greatest nation in the world. Tragically, what we've seen, especially the last two election cycles, a lot of Greek Americans have become Republican, and Trumpers. So the purpose behind this was a reminder, as I never want to be the guy who's like the big fat Greek wedding who says Greeks invented this and invented that. But the truth is, democracy came from Greece. We were the first democracy. And so for our community to lose those values and those ideals, we're not saying you have to be a Democrat. We're saying we have to protect democracy, that voting is important. Free and fair elections are important. To lie and create this illusion that there's voter fraud when it essentially doesn't exist is so dangerous to our institution. And what has made this the greatest country in the world that my parents crossed an ocean to be a part of, and so many Greek Americans traveled across an ocean to be a part of, we've forgotten those ideals and those values. So we're putting serious money behind this. As you mentioned, we're in the New York Times. We have Greek Americans like Tom Hanks, elected officials on both sides of the aisle, former generals, philanthropists to say, hey, Greek Americans, like, we want to shake you up and say, this is not about Democrat or Republican. This is about right and wrong. This is about the future of our country. We hope that it's resonating, but you know, the greatest trick that Donald Trump has ever pulled is to convince so many people to vote against their own self-interest, and that continues to blow me away. That people that don't just have a Donald Trump sign, but they've got flags and tattoos, are the ones who are going to be most harmed, and their families are going to be most harmed by him getting elected. And I don't want to get into too much of the, you know, the politics of this, but we've been spending a lot of time, Clarisol, talking about talking to union families and organized labor, and to see the amount of especially white men and men in general, who, even though President Biden has been arguably the best president in the history of the United States for organized labor, the first president in the country to walk a picket line, to fight for an increase in the minimum wage, versus probably the worst president in the history of the United States when it comes to organized labor and unions, and who he appointed to the National Labor Review Board, and his pushing back on the minimum wage, attacking the UAW workers, all these things. And yet you got these labor unions that have 70%, 75% of the membership are now Trumpers. It literally blows me away. So sorry, it's a long-winded answer, but we're trying to convince people we're not telling you who to vote for, but look at your own self-interest. Look at what you came to this country for, and you're literally going to war for someone who could care less and is actually destructive to all the things we value.
Well, thank you. I found it, again, very, very moving, and something that I think should be a model for many different immigrant communities and communities in general. But you touched on, you know, election fraud. And Lauren, I was hoping I can direct this question to you. I mean, historically, the US has been a model for free and fair elections around the world. But even so, these rampant accusation of election fraud persist. Is there actual fraud in our elections? And if so, where and at what scale?
Sure, thank you. So I will kind of take this question in two parts. First, kind of the attacks that we are seeing on our election security in reality, and then kind of the claims of fraud and what is actually being done to address election security. So first, the bad news, for lack of a better word, which is that our elections are extraordinarily secure. Voter fraud is just vanishingly rare. It is more likely that you will be struck by lightning than you will see voter fraud actually happen. And so even though our elections are so extraordinarily secure, we've seen an unprecedented number of lawsuits this election cycle aimed at making our elections seem less secure than they really are. So roughly 100 lawsuits, a truly staggering number, have been filed already across many of the battleground states in what is, again, a very well-funded and well-coordinated effort to raise legal claims rooted in conspiracy theories about things like rampant voter fraud, non-citizens voting, and insecure voting machines. Now, almost all of these cases are frivolous. They are not rooted in law or fact, and so they're really not a threat to election security or voting access at this point. We don't think they're going to be successful. But what is really concerning is that in reality, they're more about a PR campaign than a genuine effort to win legal results. The concern is that they are part of a messaging strategy to undermine trust and create a generalized impression that our elections are insecure. And in a worst case scenario, as you pointed out, Secretary, there's something that a losing candidate could point to after the election in an attempt to overturn the results. So it's something that I know we and many other election groups and election officials are monitoring very closely. So that's the bad news. The good news is that, contrary to what these lawsuits would actually have you believe, over the past several years, state and local election officials have actually taken even more critical steps to address two of the most actual significant threats to our election security, which is potential attacks on cyber and physical security in our elections, and threats of violence and harassment against election officials and workers who actually make our elections work. So when it comes to improving cyber and physical security, for example, our research suggests that over 90% of state and local election officials have taken some sort of action to increase election security since 2020, which is great news. Those steps include things like securing access to computer systems, updating polling place emergency response plans, and upgrading voting machines. And in a really particularly piece of good news, thanks to these voting machine upgrades, more than 98% of all votes cast in this election system will have a paper record, which is widely recognized as one of the most important security measures that states can adopt. Because that means when voter selections are recorded on paper, that voters can easily verify that their ballot accurately reflects their choices. And it also facilitates post-election audits, where election workers can check the paper records against the electronic voting machine records to confirm that the voting machines are working as intended and without any outside interference. And so when it comes to protecting election workers as well, that's a priority that's really just more important than ever. The spread of election-related conspiracy theories has resulted in just an unprecedented level of threats against the people who work our elections. And in fact, the latest edition of our annual survey at the Brennan Center found that almost 40% of local election officials have experienced threats or abuse or harassment just for doing their job. But the really great news is that since 2020, at least 19 states and DC have passed new laws that increase protections for election officials and poll workers, including many in swing states that see a really heightened level of violence. And the U.S. Department of Justice has also launched an elections threat task force to investigate these threats and provide federal support as well. So the short takeaway is that 2020 was already widely regarded as one of the most secure presidential elections in our nation's history by bipartisan experts. And since 2020, election officials have only worked to further strengthen those safeguards. So we are in a great place when it comes to election security. It's the rumors and the misinformation that is the real cause for concern.
Can I just add?
Absolutely.
Well, Lauren, that's like the most perfect answer I've ever heard. And the truth of it, the other point that's germane to her comments, not only is it safer than ever, not only are ballots more secure than ever, but we've done this while making literally as easy as possible for people to vote. You know, we do a lot of things wrong in the state and in this country, but we have worked tirelessly to make it as easy as possible to vote. If you'd have told, you know, my parents when they finally became citizens that they can vote on a Sunday, they can vote early, they can mail in their ballot. There's almost no excuse for people not to vote. We've extended the hours, the days, everything to make it as easy as possible. That's why, again, I started by saying Donald Trump is igniting these flames of distrust and dangerous rhetoric and attacks on our election monitors and our delegates. It's crazy. And you know, I'm on a text chain. And by the way, I should also mention Election Day is a holiday. So for example, Secretary of State employees are not, like, we're doing everything we can to incentivize people to do what should be a no-brainer. I'm on a text chain with a bunch of Secretaries of State, and you know, as you may have heard already today, there was incendiary devices placed in a ballot drop box in Washington and in the state of Oregon. You know, this is troubling behavior. And to Lauren's point, they're saying that voting is there's voter fraud and all this nonsense, which is complete BS, which is causing people to put incendiary devices in ballot box and act crazy. Instead of ramping it down, again, I'm not trying to be partisan this evening, but instead of ramping down the rhetoric and saying let's trust the system, which any responsible candidate ever running for office, except for one person, would be doing, he's just firing things up even more. And that's what, to get to your first question, that's what concerns me when we say is our democracy at a tipping point. This is not some crazy lone wolf guy who's saying things that no one's listening to. Half the country is listening to and following him. So that's the part that concerns me.
Alexi, have you heard from your colleagues in red states? I mean, clearly we know these things are happening, but you know, I think regardless of who's in office, we know that the people who are doing the hard work of making sure that our elections are, you know, fair and they're secure, you know, what are you hearing from your counterparts, your colleagues in red states and blue states?
They are not to put a plug in for the importance of Secretary of State races. And this is actually, I've been giving a lot of bad news and being Nancy negative tonight, but the truth of the matter is, I do think, at least we saw in the last election cycle, the election deniers who were running for offices of Secretary of State and Senate and like state house races really got hammered pretty badly, especially in red states. To give you an example, in both Nevada and New Mexico, the election deniers were running for Secretary of State, and there was no gray area. And in states that were pretty red, especially during non-presidentials, they both got crushed, thankfully. Otherwise, imagine the person who's supposed to certify an election saying they won't certify it. They literally ran campaigns based on that. So it's a long way of saying the Republicans that are in office are, ironically enough, the election deniers, but they're in red states, so they're not going to deny as long as their candidate wins. So it's a little bit irrelevant. The only concern I have are Republican Secretary of State in purple states or ones that will be close. That's a little scary, but again, we do have some folks who, someone I've become pretty friendly with, who have done the right thing. Secretary of State in Georgia got a lot of pressure on him last election cycle to overturn Georgia's not certified Georgia's election. He, to me, was an example of courage and doing the right thing, and the party went after him. So Brad's a great guy, and Democrat Secretary of States are blown away that we have to defend literally doing our job.
Thank you. Lauren, I'd like to turn it back to you. You recently co-authored a piece for the Brennan Center entitled "Election Deniers Continue Attempts to Meddle with Certification, but the Process is Resilient." Can you shed light on what the election certification process looks like and what vulnerabilities and strengths exist in that system?
And I will say it's rare that I get to talk about election certification with the Secretary of State. So this is a real privilege this evening. But certification has historically been a very boring formality in the post-election process, which is why I think in many ways it feels like this hasn't been an issue in the news until this year. It's an issue I started writing about several years ago, and I assumed no one would ever read anything about it. So we're in a real changed system right now. So what happens after an election is local election officials and poll workers start in the days afterwards, completing a very rigorous multi-step process to count the votes and ensure the count is correct. And certification is very simply the process by which local election officials sign off on the completion of that process to say that, yes, all of the steps to ensure that the results are accurate have already taken place. It's really nothing more than an important but symbolic formality that signifies the end of the vote counting process. A good analogy that I like to use is it's kind of like a graduation ceremony where certification is the point where you are walking across the stage to get to your diploma after someone has already audited your transcript to make sure you've passed all of the classes and met all of the requirements. Now, across the board, state laws make it very, very clear that certification is a mandatory duty for election officials. And that's because there are other procedures like election contests and court proceedings that are specifically designed to answer any legal questions about the election results. So in other words, these local certifying officials are not selected for their knowledge of their law. They are not legal experts. So those questions have to be left up to the courts. But despite this very, very clear precedent that's been the case for over 100 years in our country, in the last few years, we've seen this new phenomenon in the election denier movement, whereby rogue local certifying officials have started to refuse to certify election results, rooted again on these false claims of widespread fraud in our election. And that's why you may have seen it on the news or in your timeline this election cycle. Already, more than 30 local officials have attempted to actually refuse to certify results since 2020. And already this cycle in the primaries, we've seen attempts to refuse to certify results in places like Michigan, Nevada, and Georgia. So the really important takeaway right now is that none of these efforts have been successful thus far. every state has really strong enforcement mechanisms in place to compel certification in the event that a local official refuses to do so, which means that we don't anticipate any of these refusals are going to be successful in actually disenfranchising voters this election cycle. But what these refusals do risk is slowing down the post-election process and creating a general sense of confusion and chaos once again, all of which can sow doubt in our elections. So what's important is that voters remember, if they see a refusal to certify in their jurisdiction, that does not mean that there was a problem with the election or that's reason to distrust the process. And it's important to remember that there are processes in place to make sure their votes get certified and counted on time, and to not let any of this news deter them from actually going to the polls.
Thank you. Alexi, do you have any concerns in the certification of the election here in Illinois?
No, and it's Lauren gave a great answer. And to those of you who want to experience what certification looks like, we're going to do it in Springfield. I believe it's on December 17th. Our goal is to make it as open and transparent as possible. And I can say that as Secretary of State and as the elected official who's in charge of certification, that whoever the State Board of Elections tells us is the winner here in Illinois, we will certify the election in their favor. And I can say that unequivocally, regardless of my party or how I feel about a candidate. And I think to Lauren's point, the system has proven safe. I feel pretty good about our ability, even for those, you said, was it 20, Lauren, elected officials have said they're refusing to certify. In general, if you look at as a nation and the protections we have in place, I feel people should sleep pretty well at night. I think, again, as I started, the bigger challenge is, if Donald Trump loses, are they gonna, are they putting in place the infrastructure to make this messy? That's my biggest concern.
Well, let's dig a little deeper to some of this political polarization. The events following the 2020 election, including the January 6th insurrection and the ongoing election denialism, they've dramatically changed the political landscape. How do you see these developments impacting voter trust and engagement moving forward? And this is for anyone either of you who want to take it first.
I'm happy to give you my opinion on it, Lauren. If you want to go first, I don't want to take the stage from you.
Go ahead. I will happily follow you.
Okay. So my theory on this is I'm sort of conflicted. I think on the one hand, you hear people saying, I'm so disgusted by the process. Who do I trust? What news do I listen to? One person is saying this is all a fraud. The other one saying COVID was started by Michelle Obama and Bill Gates, and like it's this crazy hodgepodge. But then I do think you're seeing really strong early voting numbers across the country. So it makes me think that people hopefully are a little more engaged. It hasn't had too much of a negative impact. If anything, it's brought some attention to the fact that we have an election. Again, the part that blows me away, I've seen polling on January 6th, and I've seen polling on, let's call it election denialism, and they both poll very poorly. Like any normal candidate would not talk about January 6th in any sort of remotely positive way, nor would they talk about denying the results of an election. Yet one party continues to do so. And shockingly, I don't understand this, their numbers haven't gone down. So that part is confusing to me. I do think at the end of the day, it's not going to have a huge impact on voter turnout, which I guess is good news if more and more people are engaged and actually go out to vote. We'll have more data on early voting numbers, I think, on Friday and Saturday, but so far they've been really strong, anecdotally and based on that data.
But before I turn it over to Lauren, I'm just curious, what do you think we can do to build trust across party lines? Because what you're saying is that it just doesn't, if this was another candidate, a state level official or, a local level official, you would not have the same reaction. But so what can we do to build this bridge back with folks on, on the other side of the aisle?
We can raise some money tonight and buy Fox News. I mean, I'm half joking, but the truth of the matter is, people get their information from a source, and they just listen only to that source and follow that same source on social media and hang out with people who watch the same source of news, and it becomes this vicious cycle, and their positions only get deepened and strengthened. So if I knew the answer to that, I'd get a Nobel Peace Prize. I just, again, to the point I made earlier, the amount of people who know that they're voting against their own self-interest and don't care because they're enamored with this like vision of Trump, blowing up the system. And if you're unhappy or if things are going wrong, then Trump's the guy, even though he has no solutions, by blowing up the system and turning everything on its head and saying the craziest stuff, that your problems will either go away or then everyone will have the same problems. It's tough for me to answer that when it just does not make it. I don't even have an ability to argue with someone or to convince someone who feels that way.
Lauren, I'll turn it over to you.
Sure, that's a great segue, because one of the things that I want to dig in on is one of the most unfortunate aspects of the election denier movement, which has been the surge in laws that are making it harder to vote, which risks situation in which voters do decide it's too difficult, it's too time consuming, it's too burdensome to cast a ballot. And so they elect to stay out of the process altogether, as the secretary mentioned. And now, to be sure, this surge actually did start even before the 2020 election. Ever since the Supreme Court's 2013 decision in Shelby County, which invalidated a key provision of the Federal Voting Rights Act, we've seen just a significant uptick in laws that make it more difficult to vote across the country. The numbers are really significant. Since 2012, at least 31 states have passed over 115 restrictive laws that make it harder to access the ballot. And what we've seen is that that movement has really intensified since the 2020 presidential election in January 6th. So more than 2/3 of those 115 laws were passed just since 2020. So what that means is that this election cycle, voters in more than half the country will vote under more restrictive voting laws than they did in 2020, and laws that they don't have experience with. These new laws target things like mail voting, things like banning drop boxes. They impose stricter voter ID requirements, and they also limit the types of assistance available to voters who are trying to cast their ballot. So that's the bad news. The good news is that the age-old tools that people have been using for centuries in our country really work when it comes to getting out the vote. Talking to your neighbors, encouraging them to check their voter registration status ahead of the election, maybe even giving someone a ride to the polls, those solutions are the same. And when it comes to building trust across party lines, I think one of the most encouraging things I've witnessed is that we've seen that when people get involved in elections and volunteer as poll workers specifically, they actually come away with more trust in the process than they had before. So in 2022, it's a good example. That year, we saw a national effort to recruit people who subscribed to falsehoods about elections as poll workers. So something that understandably raised alarm bells for voting rights activists and election officials, lest some of those people try to interfere with voting or intimidate voters. But instead, something just really miraculous happened, where across the country, election officials reported that the poll workers who walked in skeptical of elections walked away more confident in the process and how it worked once they saw all of the checks in place and saw that the system was secure. So by and large, just encouraging people to participate in the voting process and reminding them of all the checks in place really does work, which I find very encouraging in this otherwise kind of dark political time and polarizing time that we're in.
Can I add to Lauren's point? She's 100% right about people who are part of the process or witness the process firsthand. The other thing we've done here in Illinois, which I'm proud of, we've spent a lot of time as Secretary of State in modernizing and fixing our automatic voter registration system, so that when you go to get your driver's license or state ID, you're automatically registered to vote. We want to make the process as easy as possible. Last year, we passed a bill that we're very proud of to pre-register 16 and 17-year-olds who get their driver's license, so that when they turn 18, they are already pre-registered. We've seen other states that have done this in the past, I think 7 or 8 of them, and their voter turnout increased by anywhere from 24 to like 38%, depending on the state. So in addition to making voting as easy as possible, as Secretary of State, we've worked hard to make registering to vote as simple as possible. We're proud of that. We're seeing other states take the lead on that. So there's more good news that, what you don't want is to have someone the day before election, they say, I want to go vote, but I never registered. Where am I? What's the process? Which happens more than you think. We're handling a lot of that for folks who have a state ID or have a license, which is, 8 million people here in Illinois.
I have a 16-year-old at home, and I know she is very bummed that she cannot vote in this election, but I did tell her that she could pre-register to vote. So thank you for your efforts to expand, because I do think that when young people from, the age of 16 are already thinking about voting, that's something that will become part of how they operate and they're civically engaged. So I know that you have expanded voter access. What can you tell us about vote by mail in Illinois? I know that's something that we've been expanding for quite some time. And, do you believe that there are other ways that we can continue to broaden access for voters in Illinois?
We've done a lot. I'm sure Lauren has the figures, but again, back to the analogy said about getting struck by like mail-in voting is incredibly secure. It's very reliable. There is essentially no voter fraud when it comes to mail-in voting. We have really made it as easy as possible. I had someone this morning, I was getting a cup of coffee. She thought we did it, so I took the credit for it on a Monday morning. But she said, I can't believe I landed yesterday and I felt like voting, and I never knew that you could vote on a Sunday. So I went and voted because my schedule is so crazy. So she said, thank you. It's like we are literally making the process as easy as possible. So if you're not voting this day and age, and this is probably a controversial thing to say, you pretty much don't want to.
Great. Well, thank you for what you've done for us in Illinois. Lauren, I want to turn to you. We often hear about misinformation and disinformation, and this continues to pose significant challenges to all of us. Can you share a little bit about what, social media platforms or what you're seeing around the country, maybe governmental bodies who are working to reduce the spread ahead of the election?
Sure. So when we look at misinformation, on the one hand, it has been a problem in our elections for as long as we have held elections in this country. And that way it's not new. But as we've all experienced, social media and AI has really brought misinformation and the ease with which it can spread to just a whole new level none of us were prepared for. So since 2020, the unfortunate reality is just that the major social media companies have dramatically cut back on staff resources devoted to addressing false election information. So teams responsible for things like trust and safety and integrity and content moderation and AI ethics and responsible innovation, all of those things, they were victim to a series of layoffs in the tech industry beginning in late 2022, and we just have not seen them come back. So the good news is, at least if we don't have that kind of regulation at the social media companies themselves, state and election officials have really stepped up in preparation for this election cycle. So state officials and election officials have recognized, for example, that AI just threatens to supercharge the risk of misinformation, and they've responded through legislation. So 19 states and DC have passed laws to regulate the use of deep fakes, which are basically just artificial images or audio or videos generated by artificial intelligence tools in political communications, including swing states like Arizona and Michigan and Wisconsin, where that's going to be really important. And election officials have also been holding scenario planning exercises to develop best practices for responding to AI threats, including things like deepfakes and rapidly spreading misinformation before or on or even in the post-election day period. So as I look forward and what we can do for future elections, the obvious thing is social media companies can actually beef up those resources again and restaff those teams. But relatedly, one of the interesting things is that a lot of platforms only address falsehoods about when, where and how to vote, and in some cases, some falsehoods that could confuse people about whether they can access a polling place. But there's obviously just a lot of content that falls outside of this type of information that's still problematic, including falsehoods about post-election processes like certification and election officials themselves. So if there is an effort to challenge the election results after November 5th, having emergency content moderation measures in place that address these types of falsehoods about the election process during that really tenuous period will really be particularly important. And it's something that I hope we're able to address in future years.
Secretary Giannoulias, is there anything that you want to add to that? I know one of the questions in the chat that I'm going to throw in here is, how can everyday Americans oppose the spread of election misinformation?
You know, a lot of it is just being more engaged, like hopping on a Zoom on a Monday night to hear the realities of how infrequent and almost non-existent voter fraud is, and then taking that message and telling people, and again, you know, reaching across the aisle and saying, hey, vote for who you want to, but just so you know, our democracy, you know, there is no voter fraud, that the system is safe, that this doesn't exist. The problem is there's so many different conspiracy theories out there that it becomes challenging. But I would say start like hyper local. You know, when I was growing up, that's why I mentioned my parents were immigrants. When my father became a citizen, I remember voting was such a big deal. It was such an honor for him to vote. And we lived in an apartment building. He thought that you should vote with a suit and tie on. And he would literally dress me and my brothers up in our suits and ties. We'd get in the elevator just to go downstairs, walk into like the rec room, vote, and then go back upstairs and take our suits off and like go to school. Like it was he really felt that voting, you should put a suit and tie on to vote. Like that's what it meant. And to be honest with you, I didn't even realize that voting was an option. Like I thought if you were allowed to vote, you voted. And that's how my family was. And I just wish we can bring it home more too. Like I engage my kids, even though they're very little. I talk to them about the importance of voting. I tell my friends and their family, and like reminding them to vote, telling them about the process, and giving them stats on how safe we are in this country. It's kind of a simplified answer, but that's the way to start. And I think there is a lot. If you do your homework, you're able to see a lot of the data that really backs up the things that Lauren has said. The problem is not enough people pay attention to that because they love the conspiracy theories and the nonsense. And again, that's why what Donald Trump is doing, to me, is so fundamentally dangerous to the entire system and to the integrity of the system. And with like this, he could fix so many of these problems, but he's inflaming it and just making it worse.
It does seem like we have an opportunity with our young ones, right? With our children who, you know, we can work on, you know, having them be more civically engaged. And to that point, we have an audience question. Are there any programs currently that you're aware of, either one of you in schools that you could point to that you're aware of that could be good for our children to be exposed to, or young people, or just anyone in general? Lauren, is there, I know you're at a school of law, so you must have the answers, and where should we go to get more educated in this area?
Well, I will say that in Illinois, and I'm a proud graduate of this program, as a high school student, you can be an election judge, which is an amazing way to get involved in the process and learn the ins and outs yourselves. There are also just many opportunities to observe the polls depending on where you live. If you're at all related to the legal profession as a law student or as a paralegal, even or a legal assistant, you can volunteer with the Election Protection Hotline, which is 866-OUR-VOTE. A great way to get involved as well. So a lot of amazing ways to get informed. And I'm sure there are more Illinois specific opportunities as well that I'm missing.
Anything happening, Alexi, through the Secretary of State's office that we should be aware of?
You know, we've tried through legislation, even when I was state treasurer. I'm a big believer in civics education. I'm a big believer in the importance of, we teach kids algebra and trigonometry and all these. They're important, but there is a lack of civics education. And I tell people all the time, people who come up to me in the street and say they hate me or they're so disgusted with politicians. And the first thing I say is, who's your state rep? And literally 0 out of, I don't know, 500 have ever known who their state rep is. I go, fine, who's your state senator? And literally no one has ever known. And I say, fine, I will eat the shit sandwich here, and I will admit that politicians suck. Tell me who a U.S. congressman or congresswoman is. And almost maybe 2 out of 500 have ever even known who that is. So you have people who are so angry at the system and hate the way things are going, but they don't even know who their elected officials are. So, when I travel and I talk to young groups, I tell them to be engaged, learn about their local level elected officials, learn about the process. And if your school won't teach it, do it on your own. I agree with Lauren. The ability to be an election judge is so cool. There's so many ways that we're trying to engage people. And this is a bigger problem with our society. They're more inclined to play video games and, go on social media apps than they are to just like learn the basics of government, how it works, and the impact that the decisions have on their lives.
So as we're getting closer to wrapping up our hour together, we are 8 days from the general election. I would like to ask, what strategies do you think that we can employ here in the last week to energize and engage voters? I get texts about concerts and rallies, but what can we do here in the last stretch to make sure that people are engaged? I'll start with you, Lauren, and then turn it over to Alexi.
Sure. So the first and most important thing I always tell people is excite people based on those down ballot races. You might see the presidential election is futile, but there's so many great things like judges and school boards and referendums and your state reps and your congressional reps. There's so many opportunities to get involved and really have an impact on a local and state level in addition to the presidential election. And in addition to that, we can all just, again, make sure we're reaching out to everyone we know and saying, did you check your voter registration access? It's less of a problem in Illinois, thanks to the many great programs we have in place. But there are a lot of states where people may have been removed from the polls and don't realize it. So checking earlier as soon as possible is really pivotal. And again, when it comes to misinformation, make sure you are getting your news from trusted, verified, fact-based news outlets. And if you see someone who might be confused about elections, when in doubt, refer them to your local election official website, their government website, whatever you can, where they can really get a good grasp on what's actually happening, or even encourage them to call and actually ask those questions themselves. Because when it comes to our election, the most important thing is just that people aren't deterred from accessing the ballot because they think it won't matter, and it really does.
Thank you, Lauren. Those are all really great things for us to have in our back pocket. So thank you. Alexi?
Yeah, I would say, I always ask them what their plan is. I don't say, did you vote or are you going to say, I say, what's your plan to vote? And you'd be surprised, sometimes engaging them makes them ask that question of others. Well, I plan on voting early so that I can take my grandma to go vote. And like just having them think about that, wow, in order for me to take my grandma to vote, I probably should vote since she lives in a different area, or my grandfather or whatever. So I always say, what's your plan? Vote early. If you're worried about a work issue coming up, that day off of work, vote early. If you know you're going to be out of town, think about your plan ahead of time. The amount of people who, and again, I've seen polling on that have the data on me, who say they intend to vote, who are actually passionate about this election, and then you talk to them the day after, and they say, oh, I didn't vote for this reason or that reason. That means they never even thought of a plan to vote. And I also want to say, I do think that, to end on a somewhat encouraging note, I am proud of a lot of our celebrities. I'm proud of a lot of our sports leagues. The NFL, you can't watch an NFL game without seeing 3 or 4 commercials from a bunch of retired NFL players and current NFL players that are talking about the importance of voting. And they literally say, 50 million people watch us play on Sunday. How many of you are going to vote? I also give the NBA credit. I'm sure they're doing it this year, but last cycle, they cancel all their games and open up their stadiums for people to vote. Like, we should like cheer on the organizations and leagues and celebrities that do things the right way, because the truth of the matter is, my reach as Secretary of State is like, the people on my block and who follows me on social media. But for a lot of these apolitical folks, they can really have a tremendous impact. And for those of us who are in the middle, ask people what their plan to vote is.
I absolutely love that. What is your plan for voting? So we have our charge here. Thank you so much, Secretary Giannoulias and Lauren, for sharing this time, and especially your expertise. Your work and your perspectives shed light on this ongoing effort that we need to protect our integrity of our election process. It's a foundation that is vital to our civic life. So thank you to you, and thank you to our audience for listening and learning. I think we have our next steps in safeguarding our democracy, and that is active participation. So I urge each one of you who are on with us tonight to use what you've learned today and encourage others to have their plan to vote. I have my sign here that I pulled out. So on a closing note, thank you again for gathering this special annual tradition in honor of IWIL founding mother, Dawn Clark Netsch. We really look forward to seeing you next year, and have a great evening. Thank you so much.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.
Great job.
Bye. Thank
Thank
you.
you.
Clarisol. Thank you. Guys.
Bye.